We're starting now in lesson number 11. What can leaders do when others don't follow them? We're looking at the whole idea of conflict, and conflict is probably that one thing that leaders really hate, and it makes their ministry so difficult. The conflict can be over a number of things. It can be over the ministry itself and the direction that it's taking. It may be a conflict about doctrine, about practice, simply a personality conflict between two people who have different personality and ministry styles. It can be any number of things. It can be at times a conflict over an area where something really is being handled in the wrong way. And then other times it may be that we experience conflict even though we're doing the right thing. Somebody else has a difference of style, of opinion, of belief. What kinds of conflicts can you expect as a leader? Well, certainly there is the internal conflict with sin and our sinful nature. Paul talks about that in Romans chapter 7. Why do I do the things that I don't want to do? There's often a conflict between us and God over wills, over who's going to be in control. There's still enough sin nature in us that we tend to do that at times. There may be a conflict between leaders. One of the more famous ones in the Bible, of course, is between Paul and Barnabas, who differed over whether or not to take John Mark with them again. And so they ended up separating. But God used that conflict nevertheless. Sometimes there's conflict that a leader has within his family. Conflict with his spouse, conflict with his children. There may be conflict with other leaders in the church. It can be any number of things that brings about conflict. How do you feel about conflict? If you're like most people, you probably dislike conflict very much, and you would rather avoid it, run from it, do whatever is necessary in order to not have to face that conflict. And some of the reasons for that may be that we simply desire peace, we desire acceptance, maybe we have a lack of faith in God to work it out, maybe it's just an issue of courage. We don't really want to stand up to a situation or a person. Often external conflicts really find their source in internal conflicts. As an example, in Galatians chapter 5, verse 17, talks about the conflict between the spirit and the flesh that every one of us experiences on a daily basis. In James 4, talks about conflict due to greed, covetousness. We ending up warring with other people. We get into problems with pride, with a lack of close relationship with God. 2 Timothy chapter 2 talks about conflicts due to unnecessary things, discussions that don't lead anywhere, conflicts with people who are quarrelsome, who just have that nature of where they seem to enjoy picking fights or opposing other people. All conflict can actually be traced to Genesis chapter 3, the original conflict of wills between God and Satan. That then produced a conflict between Satan and Adam and Eve, and then Adam and Eve and God, and Adam and Eve with each other, Adam and Eve with nature. So it simply spills out. One of the things that we need to understand about conflict is that it does spread, especially if it is not dealt with. Look at these verses in question 4 in your notes in Proverbs, and you'll see all kinds of reasons for conflict. It may be a hot temper that somebody has. It may be escalating the anger instead of simply quitting, leaving it alone, deciding that it's not worth it. It may be a love of a strife or a quarrel that another person has. The enjoyment of conflict. So it can be any number of reasons that are there. We really ought to expect conflict. It's going to happen. There are going to be differences of opinions, differences of practices, differences of beliefs, differences of character. The issue is never how can I avoid conflict, because conflict is going to come. Rather, it's how can I deal with conflict in a constructive way that will actually benefit the kingdom and cause it to grow, as eventually it did, for example, in Acts chapter 16, the conflict between Paul and Barnabas. It ended up in 2 teams of missionaries going out, and the gospel was actually spread further as a result of it. God can work through conflict, and we need to recognize that. If we were to name some of the conflicts in the Bible, we would probably find one on every page in the Bible. Conflicts between God and his people, between God and Satan, Satan and his people, whether they know it's Satan behind it or not, conflicts between people and people. Paul, for example, had a conflict with the Corinthian church, and both letters, the first letter to the Corinthians, the second letter to the Corinthians, both dealt with different kinds of conflicts that he was experiencing with the church. There were conflicts within the church over leadership, who's the best leader to follow, who has the most gifts, conflicts over not dealing with sin that was taking place within the church, conflict about, are we a church that's simply going to tolerate these things, or are we a church that's open-minded and we tolerate everything? How do we handle conflict? Well, let's look first of all in the spiritual realm. In Ephesians chapter 6, it says that in our battles with other people, in our relationship conflicts, we need to recognize that there is also a spiritual factor in it, a factor behind everything. Recognizing that a lot of times our conflicts with other people are not really with them. They're with Satan, and Satan is working behind the scenes. We're to use his resources, his armor, to deal with conflict. We are to seek righteousness, to deal with things by faith, to deal with them by love and by prayer. We are to look at ourselves, as Matthew 7 talks about. Oftentimes, the problem is really internal. There's something about me that I'm not seeing that's sparking a conflict. And so when there is conflict, we ought to ask ourselves, is there something in my nature, something in the way that I'm thinking, something in the way that I'm approaching this, that I really need to look at? Maybe I'm the problem here and it's not the other person. Verse 6 seems to imply that sometimes in a conflict, it's best not to grace a conflict with a reply, but simply to walk away from it. We need to look at the situation. What are the various verses here in Romans chapter 16, verse 17, Titus 2, 10 and 11, Proverbs 17, 14 or 15, 18, Proverbs 22, 24, Proverbs 29, verse 22, 1 Corinthians 4, verse 6. We're to avoid causing divisions. And at times there are simply people who enjoy causing those divisions. And the best alternative is simply to walk away from them, to avoid that relationship altogether if we can't seem to reconcile it. If you were to look at Matthew chapter 5, verses 23 through 26, it talks about our dealing with conflicts quickly instead of letting them going on and on. When we recognize that there's an issue, we should deal with that issue right away. According to Ephesians chapter 4, verses 25 through 27, what should we not do? We should not ignore the issue. It says don't let the sun go down on this issue. Rather, speak the truth in love to try to get at the bottom of it, at the heart of it. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 15, it talks about speaking the truth, but speaking it in love, recognizing that love is the only thing that is really going to repair that damaged or that broken relationship. What's the procedure that we should use in overcoming conflict? Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 through 20 provides probably the best step-by-step approach. First of all, go directly to the person instead of taking it to other people. So often within the church, we tend to talk about it to others. We gossip, we spiritualize it by saying we need to pray about such and such or so and so. Jesus gave his disciples something of procedure, some steps to follow to resolve conflict. In Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 through 20, we see those laid out. First of all, we are to go to the person directly. The value of that is that the other person becomes less defensive if there's only you and he working on it. Secondly, if there is an issue, a conflict, you and he are the only ones that really can work through that. Our tendency and our temptation sometimes within Christian circles is to bring other people in, maybe through gossip, maybe through spiritualizing it by saying we need to pray for so-and-so or we need to pray for this situation. I would suspect that probably 95% of all conflicts within the church and within Christian organizations could be resolved if this one simple truth and practice were followed. Go to the person directly. Now, sometimes that doesn't work. You talk with each other and you still don't have a resolution. If that's the case, you may then want to take another person, perhaps somebody who is an eyewitness to what happened and can speak to them as well. This is the idea of there being several witnesses confirming something. Or it may be taking someone who is a mutual friend who acts as a mediator between the two of you and helps you to avoid becoming emotional and instead looking at the facts of the situation. Now, if that still doesn't work, Jesus encouraged his disciples to go and tell it to the church. Now, what did he mean by that? I think he meant tell it to the leaders within the church, those who are more mature, those who will help to bring the two of you together. Now, there's always the possibility that no matter what you try, it's not going to work, and the other person is simply determined that they are not going to change. When that happens, it may be required of the leadership that if the other person is wrong, that they actually remove them from the fellowship of the church. Now, the purpose of that is, again, to impress on that person the seriousness of the issue, that this is something that could damage the whole church. And so the person is removed so that they're not a bad influence on the rest of the church. Now, Jesus here gives a wonderful promise in verse 20 that I think encourages us to try to resolve conflicts. Jesus promises that where two or three are gathered together, for example, in a situation such as this of resolving conflicts, that he is actually there with them. That gives us courage. That gives us the assurance that we can call upon Jesus in prayer, we can look at His Word, and together, with His help, we can resolve that issue. So I think that promise is really an impetus to us, a motivation to deal with the situation. Now, ultimately, what's our goal in resolving conflict? It's not just to be at peace with one another, although that certainly is important. Peace within the church, within the body of Christ, the family of Christ, is so important. But it's also to restore the person who is wrong. That other person that we have the conflict with, or maybe it's us that needs to be restored in the process. We want to reconcile ourselves with the other person so that we can have our relationship back again, and our relationship with the Lord is renewed. Think back over the last couple of months. Have you had a conflict with someone in your church, in a Bible study? Maybe it's another leader within your denomination. What have you learned from this study that would be helpful in resolving that conflict so that there can be resolution? Look at our lesson today and let it be of practical value to you when it comes to resolution of conflicts. Thank you.